Welcome everyone to today's devotion. We are in Luke chapter 21, and Luke 21 is the Olivet Discourse. The Olivet Discourse is where Jesus, on the Mount of Olives, delivers a sermon on eschatology, or that is, on the end times. Now, in Matthew's gospel, it's two chapters. In Mark, it's just once, Mark 13, and here it is a single chapter. So although they have a lot of parallels, Matthew is by far the longest. But one of the things that struck me about Luke is, unlike Matthew and Mark, where it's all lumped together, Luke spreads his out, which shouldn't be surprising because he does the same thing with the Sermon on the Mount. Whereas in Matthew, Sermon on the Mount is 3 chapters, one long sermon. In Luke, it's more spread out. He does the same thing with the Olivet Discourse, or at least in terms of his discussion of the end times. It's very likely with all of these sermons and discourses, Jesus would mention them everywhere he went. And so what we get in the Gospels is an example of what Jesus said, but often in one section, as opposed to he went to this city and said the same thing, that city and said the same thing. But with that, before we can look at the Olivet Discourse and the various interpretations, how to understand it, I actually want us to look at the first 4 verses here. We know the story, but often what we do is we take the story out of its context. And although that's it's fine to isolate a story like that, but it's important that we remember that again, there's no chapter divisions in the Bible, no verse divisions in the Bible originally. Those were added by publishers and editors later for usability reasons. So notice what happens, verse 1. Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box. Now notice, that assumes we just read what was happening. And you remember, Jesus is condemning the religious elites who walk around with long robes and they devour widows' houses. And so Jesus is saying that they have profited off the back of religion and victimized particularly the poor, and judgment will come upon them. And then Jesus looks up and he sees exactly what it is that he is talking about. So he sees the rich put in their gifts in the offering box, and then he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. These are the smallest coins in the currency. And he said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them." Now, in terms of numbers, nowhere near, that they've put in a lot more in terms of the amount of money than this poor widow. But Jesus is less concerned with the dollar amount than the heart. So he'll say, "For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on." Now, a couple of things to note here. One, a lot of people take this and say, see, when we give, we should give out of the abundance of the heart. And then that is true, right? And it's a simple application to grab from here, and one that I think you can take with you anywhere. If you give in order to be praised, then you have your reward, but your reward is not in heaven with Jesus. And so that is true. One of the things I've noticed in years of ministry, 17 years or coming up on 17, 18, I don't know, but just shy of 20, that there are some churches who are financially well off that I wouldn't want to be a part of, and I'm not sure you could get me to be a part of. And then I've seen churches, been part of churches that were very poor, and yet the love of Jesus was so evident the second you walked in. If you're going to err on either side, err on the side of generosity of heart, the abundance of joy. At the same time, what we see here is Jesus giving us a lesson on giving. One of the things that we do when it comes to tithing is we often tithe out of abundance. But the teaching of Scripture is first fruits. And when we give first fruits, we are living by faith that there will be second, third, fourth, fifth, so on, other fruits, right? So the in the agricultural world of the Old Testament, a man would give his first lamb of the year, trusting that there would be other lambs. His livelihood was based off of that lamb. This is why Abraham offers Isaac in Genesis 22. He is the first fruit. He is the promised son. And he's willing to give even that over to the Lord. But really, what is really going on here? Although all of that is good, what's really going on here is Jesus is condemning religious systems. So remember, he condemns religious elites, and he says that they prey even on widows. They devour widows' houses. And then who do we meet here in chapter 21? A widow. And what happens? She gives every penny she has and essentially goes home and dies. The system doesn't care about her. She believes that what she is doing will help her, will save her. This is why the prosperity heresy is so damnable, because it victimizes the poor. It takes advantage of the weak. And how many people have given up so much so that this guy is well suited in fancy homes and a private jet? It's evil. But I would say, though that is an easy example to look at, it's not limited to them. When you threaten and use religion as a means of getting what it is that you want, and that is true for traditional religion and secular religion, what you have is a system that stands in judgment from God. And the secular worldview needs to hear that as well. Well, when he discusses her, he then is prepared to discuss judgment. Now that's different in the other Gospels. In the other Gospels, the fig tree is really, Jesus sees a fig tree that shows signs of life but is really dead, so he curses the fig tree, and that leads him to discuss the end times. Here it is the widow's mites. That she gives everything she has to this corrupt system, and Jesus is now saying it will come crashing down. And so this leads to a major interpretive challenge, and you and I are probably going to disagree on this. I'm somewhat agnostic about some of these. I think there's some truth in a lot of them, and that is, how do we read what Jesus has to say here? Let me offer just two broad views, and within them there's other stuff, but the one view is futurism. That is to say that everything Jesus says here will be ultimately fulfilled sometime in the future. So if you grew up reading Left Behind or whatever, you may be familiar with the language of the rapture, the 7-year tribulation, the rebuilding of the temple, which will only be destroyed, all of that sort of stuff. Well, that's futurism. Now, you may not hold to that sort of dispensational view of the end times, but it's a common one. And it is one of several other views of reading the end times according to the Bible. Another view worth considering is known as preterism. That is the view that says that most of what Jesus says here has already been fulfilled, and it was fulfilled in AD 70 when Rome sacked Jerusalem and there destroyed the temple, all of that. So we've talked about that off and on here and there. I'm sure we raised it again when we looked at the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25. And you see the issue right away. While Jesus was speaking about the widow, many were admiring the noble stones and offerings of the temple. And Jesus says, verse 6, "As for these things that you see, this temple, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And the question from the disciples is, when will these things be? So Jesus is clearly referencing this temple. And so here's my view, is that I believe both futurism and preterism are in play in the Olivet Discourse. That is to say, he is speaking of things yet to be in our context. At the same time, he's describing things that have already happened in our context. So perhaps, and this is typical of prophecy, there is the immediate fulfillment and the touchdown fulfillment. The end of the Old Testament, Malachi 5, is a good example of this. The language regarding Elijah is clearly eschatological, yet it's fulfilled in the immediate in John the Baptist. This is typical. We would get this. Isaiah does the same thing regarding the birth of Christ and the birth of this other son. I think this is typical. So we should be able to say Jesus is predicting the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. At the same time, I think he is also showing us and preparing us for what is to come, associated with his return. So what are some of these things? Well, verse 10, I'm just going to look at a few of these. Nation will rise against nation. Verse 11, great earthquakes, famines, pestilences, great signs from heaven. That is typical. You will be persecuted there, verse 12, verse 13. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. One of the things that we miss here is how often we get caught up in the fantastical nature of the end times. We miss the application in here. That Jesus is saying that when this comes upon you, endure to the end. Whatever that end might be. It might be ending in your death, or it might be ending in the return of the Son of Man. Regardless, endure and use this opportunity to bear witness. This is where the term martyr comes from, this word witness. It means to bear witness. And for martyrs, it is people bear witness by suffering and death. Verse 20, you will see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Now, that is very obviously was fulfilled in the late 60s, early 70s of Jerusalem. It was surrounded by armies, and the desolation came in destruction of the temple. At the same time, there are others who say this is something that we have to look forward to, or not look forward to, but anticipate happening again. And it even says there in verse 24, Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles. Again, that is what happened in AD 70, when Titus, who was then general, would later become emperor, destroyed, sacked Jerusalem. Right? So I do think that though some what Jesus says is clearly fulfilled at this time, and even some of the other language of earthquakes and famines and pestilences and everything else, all of that is fulfilled in Jerusalem at this time. Yet at the same time, it could be also a future element to this as well. And there's plenty of people on both sides and every side in all of this. So my goal isn't to convince you really of either of those. And then comes the Son of Man, verse 25 to 28, and then we get the fig tree lesson. In Matthew's gospel, the Olivet Discourse is bookended. You're introduced and concluded with the fig tree. In Luke's, it's just at the end. Verse 29, look at the fig tree and all the trees as soon as they come out in leaf. You see for yourselves and know that the summer is already near. Then verse 32, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all has taken place. Now, there are multiple ways to read this generation language. One is the preterist view, and the more natural reading is that those who hear Jesus, that generation will not pass until the destruction of Israel or Jerusalem. And that was fulfilled, AD 70. So 40 years, less than, from when Jesus gives these words. Another view says that that Jesus will return once these signs are fulfilled, and so they have a futurist view. If you grew up with Left Behind sort of a mentality of dispensationalism, premillennial dispensationalism is the fancy phrase, you probably heard it was 1948, Israel becomes a nation. 1967, Israel takes control of Jerusalem for the first time in 2,000 years, and that was this generation will not pass. I don't know. I think we're fishing with some of that, but nevertheless, the views on what this generation means are many. But notice the application, verse 34 to 36. But watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life, and that day come upon you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. But stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place, and to stand before the Son of Man. With his point is that you should always be ready for the return of the Son of Man, and live your life ready for when he returns. Was it that Martin Luther is credited as saying? I don't know if he actually said it, but he's credited with it. If I knew the Lord was to return today, I would still plant my apple tree. Was his point? If you are in and living in the will of God, keep doing what it is that you are called to do. Plant that apple tree, if it be the will of God. Grow in faith. Grow in Christ, for that is the will of God. Lord willing, see you guys here tomorrow. Look at Luke chapter 22.